Okay, I think we can start. We'll let people in as they arrive. Welcome everybody. Today we have Tara Slough from NYU. She's going to present the Bureaucratic Quality and Electoral Accountability. Just as a reminder, this is 45 minutes plus possibly 15 minutes for questions. But Tara, if you need a few more minutes, we're not going to be too worried about that. Tara is by herself here, so if you have questions, perhaps unmute yourselves rather than just put them in the chat. But if you do want to put them in the chat, I'll interrupt Tara at some point and ask the question for you. Okay, so before we begin, just a reminder that next couple of weeks, on the 28th of November, we have Monu Prem, who's going to present a paper titled "Do Explosions Shape Voting Behavior?" And I assume if you're caught in the explosion, it definitely will shape yours. But we'll see you in 2 weeks. Tara, the screen is yours.
Great. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for coming. I've been looking forward to this semester. So yeah, as Francesco said, please feel free to interrupt, raise your hand, just sort of chime in. This is a paper called Bureaucratic Quality and Electoral Accountability. So I study sort of largely empirically, I study Latin America and sort of low and middle income democracies. And I think one thing that's characteristic of how we talk about these type of democracies is that we see sort of pervasive, quote unquote, bad governance. And when I say this, I mean things like fairly high levels of corruption, lack of public goods and services. And, this is often cited as evidence of limited electoral accountability, right? These are things that voters tend not to like. And so the question becomes, how is it that voters can choose their leaders and sort of kick leaders out of office, and yet we still see sort of these behaviors that voters ostensibly don't like. So there's been a lot of work on information as a possible antidote to these problems. So the logic being perhaps voters just don't observe the corruption, or they just don't observe sort of the lack of public goods and services. And so if we were to provide more information before an election, perhaps they would, be able to update, learn about the politician, and then they would be able to kick out, bad politicians or reward good ones. So I think, this literature has a number of challenges that I wanted to address in this paper. So first, the last set of studies that I talked about, which are, largely experimental, I think we have a lot of conflicting findings about what information is doing, what voters are learning, and how they're using information to, reward or sanction politicians. And I think the second thing, which was more frustrating to me, is I think we have a very asymmetric treatment of sort of what sort of the outcomes of limited accountability in developed versus developing democracies. So you look at sort of literature from the US, and it's like maybe, sharks or sports outcomes change voters' votes and they might be irrational, but we don't necessarily attribute sort of worse long stream outcomes to that. Whereas in developing democracies, it's voters are uninformed or politicians are somehow worse. And as a result, everything else is bad. And I found this sort of unsatisfying. So I want to present a model and some sort of empirical tests that provide a different perspective on this that tries to unite some of the empirical patterns that we see. So this argument is sort of premised on the idea that, public goods or public services are ultimately co-produced by politicians and bureaucrats, right? So within this story, and I think which is consistent with, how the world works, politicians allocate funding for projects or public goods, but then they rely on bureaucrats to produce or implement the public goods in some way. Okay. And one thing that we know empirically is that globally, bureaucratic quality varies substantially. And so the idea here, or the main idea, is that bureaucratic quality is going to drive the efficiency of public goods investments. And this is going to have sort of two main effects. First, it's going to provide politicians with different incentives to allocate a budget to public goods versus private rents, sort of taking the money and running. And voters are then going to, when they observe public goods or lack thereof, they're going to update on politician type in order to try to select the competent ones. But really what they can learn from observing public goods outputs is really dependent on what politicians are doing in equilibrium. And sort of when we have variation in what politicians are doing, there's variation in how much voters should be learning. So I want to just give a quick overview before going into the model. So I'm going to give you a very simple model of electoral accountability that has a voter, a politician, and a largely reduced form bureaucrat. And what I want to use this model to do is two things. First, I want to show you that we see different equilibria emerge at different levels of bureaucratic quality. So electoral accountability looks different as a function of bureaucratic quality. And second, I think that these equilibria imply distinct empirical implications of what accountability relationships between voters and politicians should look like. I'm then going to show you either one or two, depending on time, theoretically structured meta studies that test the empirical implications against sort of two special cases that I see with as sort of consistent with existing arguments. And so what I'll do first, and for sure in this talk, is I want to extend 4 different studies of accountability of Brazilian mayors, 3 on corruption and accountability that allow us to look at politician behavior and voter beliefs about politician type, and then 1 on incumbency disadvantage, which allows us to look at voting behavior. And then if time permits, I want to think about how treatment effects in 12 information and accountability experiments vary in sort of a measure of national bureaucratic quality. So using this data, I find that, the data is consistent with this full model that, allows for bureaucratic co-production of public goods, and not either the alternatives that sort of leaves bureaucrats out of the picture entirely. So in Brazil, I will show you that politicians allocate funds to rents as opposed to public goods as a function of bureaucratic quality, and that voters are going to update on politicians differently at different levels of bureaucratic quality within their municipality. And finally, I'll show you some sort of suggestive evidence that voter retention of incumbents tends to vary in bureaucratic quality in ways consistent with model predictions. And then in these sort of information field experiments where voters are given sort of signals of politician, behavior or politician or, outputs, I show that there's suggestive evidence that the effects of information vary in bureaucratic quality in ways that are ostensibly related or consistent with the theory. Okay. So I will certainly show you the data from Brazil. We may or may not get to the information experiments.
Tara, can I ask a question myself?
Yes, please
right
do.
Off the bat. I guess all of this leads to the assumption that bureaucratic quality is observable, or at least
Yes.
Common knowledge.
Yeah.
So in terms of the evidence that you have, I mean, to me, that is a bit of an empirical question. I mean, is it obvious that voters, I mean, politicians probably do know, but do voters know about bureaucratic quality?
Yeah, so in the model, it's bureaucratic quality is going to be common knowledge. So, I mean, I think that there's reasons to believe that this is the case. So, I mean, if you think about who do empirically, who do voters interact most with in the government? It's not politicians. It's, typically bureaucrats. We can measure the rate of interaction through survey data, and sort of uniformly, they interact most frequently with bureaucrats. And sort of the idea here is that at the very least, this sort of what bureaucrats are able to accomplish, seems to be observable to, people when they access services. And so we're going to sort of go off that assumption.
Can I ask just a
Please.
clarification question? When you say bureaucrat, do you mean like a central, high-level civil service here, or do you mean like, what is citizen-facing, some low-level officer in some remote location?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's sort of black boxed here as sort of a single actor. I think that, in some sense, I think you're right to say that the people who citizens observe most closely are probably those sort of most local level bureaucrats. At the same time, you know, if we think about within sort of municipal governments, a lot of these, which is sort of the setting within Brazil and actually in most of the field experiments, most of these are not super huge bureaucracies outside the largest cities. And so the extent to which those are, you know, different people or, you know, fundamentally different quality, I think is limited. All right. So I think this relates to sort of three literatures. I think there's sort of an emerging, sort of growing literature on bureaucracy and electoral accountability. It's mostly theoretical, a few empirical contributions. There's a huge body of literature of empirical studies of information and accountability, largely from the last 10 to 15 years. This is too short of a subset of that literature on this slide. And then I think the third is this idea of how to sort of use multiple studies in this sort of new type of meta study, helps us think a little bit about how we can accumulate or do secondary analysis on sort of reduced form causal estimates and try to leverage you know, learning across studies in that way. All right. So I want to start by walking you through this theory. So this is going to be a simple two-period accountability model in which we have a politician, a bureaucrat who is, you know, pretty mechanical here, and a voter. So we'll think about a politician as having two types, and we'll think about this as incompetent, which is theta lower bar, or competent, which is theta upper bar. And I think of this as largely an ability to get things done through the bureaucracy, to make sure that sort of the bureaucracy is, you know, implementing policy to the best of its capability. We'll think about this as sort of, you know, the degree to which politicians are monitoring the bureaucracy. So we can think about this as a rate of monitoring. So we'll think it's about theta upper bar as being strictly greater than theta lower bar, and both of them are going to be between 0 and 1. So the politician's type will be private information to the politician and the bureaucrat, and the citizen will have a prior that the politician is of the competent type that's equal to pi. Okay. So when we think about how are public goods produced, we'll think that in each period, so in each term for the politician, public goods are going to be co-produced by the politician and bureaucrat. So we'll think about having a budget normalized to 1. The politician will allocate some amount AT, right, which will be indexed by the period to public goods, and the remainder to private rents. We'll think that a bureaucrat that of quality Q is greater than 1, then is going to exert effort in order to produce the public good. Okay, Q is exogenous; it's common knowledge. As we've just said, so the idea that, you know, citizens have at least somewhat more exposure to the bureaucracy than, you know, perhaps their elected politicians. And we'll think about public goods as being produced according to this production function. So with probability proportional to the bureaucrat's effort, you know, we'll produce public goods proportional to bureaucratic quality and sort of the allocation of funds. And with complementary probability, nothing gets produced, right? So, you know, the money goes poof, and there is no public good to show for it. Okay. So the voter is going to observe a signal at the end of after sort of the first period public goods are produced. And we'll think about the signal as being, they'll see the first period public good. That means whether it was produced or not. So they'll see this Q AT if the public good was produced, or nothing if it wasn't. And that will happen with probability P. And if not, they will see no signal, right? And the idea here is, you know, this simply allows, you know, we could get rid of this, you know, entirely and say the citizen always sees the public good signal. Because so many of the models of electoral accountability are premised on the idea that the voter doesn't always see the signal, this is useful to put in when we sort of move to empirics, because it allows us to think about what the predictions would be like with and without voter information, okay? So what the voter values public goods. And so when the voter when the first period incumbent comes up for re-election, the voter is ultimately going to compare their expected level of public goods provision in the second period, given sort of the signal that they've seen under the incumbent or under a challenger, we'll assume that the challenger will act as a first period incumbent, right? This is going to be consistent with, the data from Brazil, but and what we'll have here, and then we'll have valence shock for the incumbent. So ultimately, the voter is going to be comparing what they expect to receive in the next period under the incumbent or under a challenger who acts as a first period incumbent.
Sorry, I must have missed it. So the theta enters this production function, right? So, or doesn't, I mean, so why do we care about theta? Why does the voter care about theta? What does
I'll show you. So basically what the politician allocates is going to depend on theta. So I'll show you how theta enters in the next slide.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry.
It's in the preferences, not in the production function.
Correct.
Right?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. So a politician, when they are in office, we're going to assume that both politicians have sort of the same, both value rents, private rents or public goods, right? So we don't have sort of a venal type or a non-venal and sort of a non-venal type. You can think about how that would look different when I show you the equilibria. But the idea here is in each term in which a politician's in office, their utility is just given by the rents that they sort of extract plus the public goods that they fund. We'll think about if the politician's not in office, we'll normalize this utility to 0 and we won't have discounting. Okay, so where theta comes in is recall that the monitoring rate theta is given by the politician's type. So a competent politician is able to sort of monitor the bureaucrat at a higher rate than an incompetent type, right? So this is where theta enters. And so the bureaucrat's utility, right? This is, in reduced form is going to be, they try to avoid a penalty when they are unable to produce the public good and effort is costly. Okay, the bureaucrat here is not going to be forward looking. So what we'll have here is sort of in the first period, nature will determine which type of politician is in office. The incumbent will then allocate funds to the public good or, take the remainder in private rents. The bureaucrat then exerts effort to produce the public good. The voter then will observe or fail to observe the public good and then vote. And then in the second period, whoever is, the incumbent will allocate funds to the public good if they're reelected. Otherwise, the challenger will do this, and then the bureaucrat will exert effort to produce the second period public good. I'm going to show you the perfect Bayesian equilibria of the game, which are unique in each parameter region under intuitive criterion. Okay. So, the bureaucrat here, as I've said, is mechanical, right? So the bureaucrat's optimal effort in both periods is going to be a function of the politician's type, right? So this is how this feeds in to the production function. And then in a second term, a politician is sort of a re-elected incumbent is simply going to determine whether or not it's efficient to produce public goods or not. So if bureaucratic quality is sufficiently high, it will make it efficient to produce the public good, and they'll devote their whole budget to that. Else they'll devote the entire budget to private rents. So I think one thing that emerges from this setting, which is not standard, is that if we think about what the sort of expected level of second period public goods are, right, this is going to, this is given by bureaucratic quality, the second period investment of the politician and the politician's type. And so here we can see that politician type and bureaucratic quality are complements. This is sort of the opposite of the, conventional idea that better bureaucrats insulate, voters or public goods from the follies of a bad politician, right? Here, you are actually going to see exactly the same sort of outcomes in terms of what bureaucratic quality does, but it occurs through the politician's allocation decision, right? So that's the mechanism for this, as opposed to an assumption that the two are complements, or that the two are substitutes, rather. So we can then think about given that we know second period public goods under the incumbent, we can then think about when the voters will vote to re-elect the incumbent over the challenger. And they'll do so if their expected utility under the incumbent is better than this first period challenger. So given sort of our valence shock, we can write the probability of re-election in this way. And so there's a couple things to note here. So recall that the voter may or may not have observed the public good, right? So if they didn't observe the public good, they're not going to update at all. And if they do observe the public good, then the informativeness of the public good signal is going to depend on what the politician is allocating in equilibrium. So like the signal, like what the signal actually allows voters to learn depends on what politicians are doing. Okay. And so I'm going to show you sort of, so we have, this should say pooling. So there are sort of 4 thresholds in bureaucratic quality. In which that sort of emerge from this. So in the first pooling equilibrium, right, which I think is largely neglected. I'm sorry for the this is mislabeled. Both types of politicians allocate nothing to public goods. So the idea is the bureaucratic quality is so low that it is inefficient for either type of politician to invest in public goods, right? As a result, the voter is never going to see, public goods in equilibrium. So this is sort of their off-path belief that sustains this. And it also ultimately, the voter is not going to learn anything from observing no public goods because both types are doing the same thing. They also don't care which, they don't have any difference in utility from a competent versus an incompetent politician here. And so here, seeing a signal that the politician provided no public goods is sort of observationally equivalent to not seeing the signal at all. Okay. This is better. So this is sort of our first this next equilibrium that emerges at slightly higher levels of bureaucratic quality is going to sort of be a separating equilibrium that I think a lot of the sort of information experiments are premised on. And the idea here is that a competent type will always allocate the funds to the public good because it's efficient to do so. The incompetent type will never do so. If the voter sees the public goods, they learn it's the good type. Right? If they see no public goods produced, remember it could be because the bureaucrat didn't work hard enough. And so they'll sort of the probability that it's the competent type is lower than the prior. And then if they don't see any information, then they don't update at all. Okay. In the next 2 equilibria, so they're sort of, I think, substantively similar, right? So in both of these, it's efficient for the competent type to allocate funds to public goods. And in these equilibria, the sort of incompetent type can be induced to pool or partially pool with the competent type in the first period. What this means is that the voter, is going to be able to learn from seeing the public good that, it's more likely that this was the competent type. If they don't see the public good emerge, it's more likely that it was the incompetent type. And then obviously with no information, they can't update. And then the last equilibrium, and so these are sort of fairly standard in accountability models, right? So we can induce, a low type to try to pool in the first period to try to get reelected. This last equilibrium is, also, I think, not common. We don't commonly discuss this in accountability models, right? So we have, both types are allocating full budget to public goods in both periods because the bureaucracy is good enough, right? So the bureaucracy is so good that like the politician gets more out of providing the public good than taking the money and running. Because of this complementarity with bureaucratic quality, ultimately, the voter's still going to be able to learn something because competent types are going to get this like public good produced at higher rates because the bureaucracy is going to work harder, or the bureaucrat's going to work harder. And similarly, if the sort of public good doesn't materialize here, it's more likely to be the incompetent type. Again, we don't learn anything from the information, from seeing no information, okay? And so this is sort of the pooling equilibrium. I think the 2 things that are unique here are sort of both of the pooling equilibria at either extreme of bureaucratic quality, okay? So you might ask, what happens if instead of observing sort of public goods outputs that are co-produced, what happens if the voter observes the politician's behavior, right, which is their allocation behavior. Since this is sort of, I think the existing empirical literature is a mix of these two things, it's worthwhile to think about what this is. So here, the only thing that's changing is the content of the signal. So the signal here, if they see first period, if they get the signal, they'll see first period allocation instead of first period public goods production. And so again, we're going to have 4 thresholds and the same sort of substantively similar equilibria. I want to highlight a couple things. First, if the voter is able to see the allocation instead of sort of the output, first, we're going to move down the 2 thresholds. So for lower levels of bureaucratic quality, the incompetent type of bureaucrat is willing to pool or partially pool with the competent type, right? And so this shrinks the region in which we observe this separating equilibrium. In the separating equilibrium, the voter gets more information, right? So it's not the case that it could have been a competent type that allocated the funds and somehow the bureaucracy didn't work hard enough. Instead, here, they're going to learn the politician's type, for sure, if they see the signal, right? So there's more learning here. I think one thing that, we have perhaps missed is that if there is pooling, either in the first period or in both periods, then it's actually better for the voter to observe the public good, right? Because of this complementarity between bureaucratic quality and, politician type. And so here, the voter is actually learning less, right? So the voter shouldn't be learning anything from observing that, the politician allocated public goods in the first period. Here, these are sort of off-path beliefs because the voter should not observe that, they didn't allocate the public goods, okay? So the idea is that we have sort of this across different levels of bureaucratic quality, we should see different, politician behavior with respect to allocations to public goods and rents. Then we should also see different people should learn in a different way at different levels of bureaucratic quality, and they should retain politicians in a different way at different levels of bureaucratic quality. And so I wanted to use the research design to try to examine these predictions. So what I want to do is I first want to use this to sort of establish the plausibility of this sort of general model versus existing alternatives. And, one problem, so there's 3 problems here, right? First is that I don't know of a study that sort of is able to measure all of these things at the same time. The second is that this is a dense literature that has a lot of findings already. And so I wanted to see to what extent can we think about using these, trying to fit these findings together in a new way. And I think that, a lot of these are using sort of 2, and I want to sort of distinguish them from the stories that are already out there. So there's sort of 2 modal existing explanations for limited electoral accountability. And sort of those are actually 2 special cases of the model. And so we're going to try to test the general model against those cases. So the existing alternatives is, one, you can think about, quote unquote, no bureaucrat. I mean, the bureaucrat is still there. It's just the idea here is that the competent type will always get their public good produced, and the incompetent type will never get their public good produced, right? And I'll show you what that looks like in a moment. And the second, I think, is the modal one that motivates a lot of the field experiments, is that we have completely uninformed voters. So voters never observe the public good signal or output, and therefore they cannot update, okay? So what I want to do is I want to think about this sort of general model, and I'm going to think about first what happens if we have no bureaucrat. Or, a politician, the politician's type completely determines, what public goods can be produced. And what this is ultimately going to do is it's going to stretch that separating equilibrium and cover the entire parameter space with that separating equilibrium in which the competent type always allocates to the public good and the incompetent type never does. Okay. In the second case, we can think about completely uninformed voters. And, this is sort of not a surprising result, right? What happens is that these 2 cut points that show where partial pooling and pooling emerge in the first period, right? Those are going to collapse to Q4, right? Because a incompetent type of politician has no incentive to, work harder or allocate more funds to public goods in the first period if the voter's never going to see it, right? And so we shouldn't see those 2 equilibria. Max?
Sorry, just to get a bit of a bird's eye view, because I think I'm lost for a second. So what you're trying to do right now is find special cases in the model and then sort of fit into them the empirical studies that are out there. Is that the plan?
So the plan is that because the empirical studies are generally premised on one of these two cases, right? So, you know, this is sort of your pure selection story. And here, you know, there's like this argument that voters just don't know anything. And so they're not updating, right? So what I want to do is I want to show you that the data is consistent with this model, but not these two special cases, right? So these two, yes, yeah. Sorry if I wasn't clear. Okay. So the idea is because we've sort of, you know, put our eggs in these two baskets in different ways, and these are not mutually exclusive, obviously. I want to sort of show that there seems to be evidence for this general model that thinks about bureaucratic co-production.
Can I ask a question as somebody, you know, more naturally inclined to follow theory than empirics, but is it, I mean, to me, the interesting point here is that you assume this complementarity between politicians' quality and bureaucrats, which from a theoretical perspective is one of the two obvious assumptions you could make. The other one would be substitutability. And of course, that, you know, I can probably come up with a story as to why that would make sense. So that, now, it seems like you're suggesting nobody's ever thought about, you know, testing empirically whether substitutability exists or not. But it seems to be that you could try to take your own model, tweak it a little bit, introduce substitutability in your model, and you know, take that data and look at that as well. Because one could argue that what the exercise you're actually doing is you are just saying the models that, you know, we test are too simple. And my model is more compatible with reality because I can explain the same things plus other things that are unexplained. But the question really is whether you are looking at the most natural alternative. Once you buy the idea that the bureaucrat and politician interaction does matter, which probably does. Right?
Yeah.
I don't know whether my point is clear, but
yeah. So I mean, I think the thing that's interesting here is not, I mean, so I didn't go into this sort of assuming that politician type and bureaucratic quality are complements, right? That comes, you know, from the idea. So basically, you know, I think our typical assumption is that they're substitutes, right? This bureaucrats protect, let's say, citizens or voters against the follies of bad politicians, right? That's sort of this, I think that's the main story that we have. In this story, we'll actually see exactly the same thing, even though they're complements, because it's sort of because of politician allocation behavior, depending on, you know, the efficiency of these public goods investments. And so I think, like, yeah, you could think about you know, how this would look like with the two as substitutes. I would need to sort of work through that. But I think the thing that's interesting here is that, like, as we see, as bureaucratic quality increases, right, when we have a bad politician, you know, voters are still better off, right, which is, you know, sort of the core insight there, I think. And so this is coming because of this strategic allocation behavior. Okay. All right. So I think the equilibria here are presenting interesting, I think, empirical implications about a couple of different things, right? So politician allocation behavior, which is going to affect public goods outputs, but I'm going to focus on the politician's allocation behavior instead of public goods outputs, because public goods are, you know, also affected by bureaucrats' behavior. Well, then we can also think about voters' beliefs about the politician type, right? And we should see different learning in different regions of bureaucratic quality here. And finally, the voters' voting behavior. Obviously, voting, I think one thing that's sometimes missed in this literature is that voting behavior should not have sort of look identical to voter beliefs, or treatment effects on voting behavior shouldn't be identical to those on voter beliefs. So we'll look at these two things separately. It's hard to measure all of the implications of the model simultaneously, but we have measured these pieces before in different places. I'm going to show you in sort of a similar context in Brazil over, sort of a 20-year period when we've been doing these studies. And I'm going to call this sort of a theoretically structured meta study that incorporates results from multiple studies. So in the first study, which is probably all that I'll cover, we'll look at the accountability of Brazilian mayors. And so what we're going to do, what we need here is we need a measure of bureaucratic quality. Like this is the sort of moderator of interest. And so what I'll do here is I'm going to measure the education level of the average municipal bureaucrat. This comes from the National Statistics Agency. We'll call it a Municipal Information Survey, and the measure comes from 2005 to 2014. This comes from counts of bureaucrats by education level, which is measured about triennially. And so you might say, okay, there's a lot of stuff. This is all observational. What drives this variation, right? So we know that there's variation in public sector hiring and contracting processes across Brazil. We also know that there's a lot of variation in local labor market conditions, right? So what I'll do is I'll include, sort of flexible covariates that include, state fixed effects, and then sort of decile bins of the percent of employment in the formal sector, average education in the municipality, GDP per capita, and population. I think it's worthwhile to note that collectively, sort of this set of, this set of covariates account for only about 20% of the variation in bureaucratic quality, which surprised me how low this was. So one sort of important, thing is that there's an assumption in the model, right, that bureaucratic quality is sort of exogenous. And so here, for the empirical study, it's like important that this is sticky, at least in the short run. So the politician isn't sort of fundamentally changing, bureaucratic quality of a municipality when they come into office. So we can think about just like the annualized autocorrelation from sort of 5 rounds of the data collection. So, I mean, the autocorrelation in sort of average education is 0.83. And then we can think about, per capita personnel and total personnel being higher, though these are largely a function of municipality size, which is why I'm focusing on this sort of quality measure. You can do a first difference models that show sort of no evidence of systematic changes in bureaucratic quality when sort of we see a change in the mayor or a change in the mayor's party, right? So there's no differential change there. And also there's no evidence of sort of differential changes in the variance of this measure, right? When we get a new mayor or a new party in power. Also for the accountability application, conditional on the set of covariates, there's zero conditional association with community radio presence. Given that this is sort of something that's big in this literature as sort of the thing that's, disseminating the signal, we don't want to sort of get these two things confused. And so at least conditional on these controls, there's zero conditional association. Okay. So how am I going to measure the politician's behavior? So I'm going to use some familiar data, right? So what we'll look at is, so the model sort of emphasizes this trade-off between funding public goods and just taking the money and running for the politician. Because public goods are co-produced, I'm going to measure rents instead, right? And I'm going to use this as sort of the audit outcomes that serve as, our measure of politician behavior. So you're probably familiar with these since Faraz and Finan in 2008. We know that in this context, mayors are the ones responsible for proposing the budget, monitoring its execution. And at least to the extent that we can look at, who are the ones that oppose these audits, right? So the lawsuits against the audits uniformly come from politicians, not bureaucrats. So I'm not particularly concerned that this is sort of just a measure of, bureaucratic quality as opposed to the decision of a mayor. We'll focus on the first 11 rounds of these audits from 2003 to 2004. These are perhaps the most studied, and we'll look at the percentage of funds that are misused. We can decompose this into different categories. It doesn't make a lot of difference. It's important to note that here, randomization I'm not looking at sort of the effect of being audited or being audited before an election. I'm sort of using these sort of random audits as random sampling to make sure that I'm observing municipalities at all levels of bureaucratic quality. And I use the first rounds to abstract from, this politician learning from audits, which we know to have taken place. In terms of measuring citizen updating, I'm going to use some survey experimental evidence to measure updating. So there's a lot of recent, I think, consternation in political science about the non-alignment between survey and field experiments on corruption, but they sort of met, to me, I think this sort of misses the point that both of them measure changes in beliefs and actions respectively. So I'm going to focus on sort of using these to measure updating or changes in voter beliefs. And I'll use a nationally representative survey that was fielded in Brazil in 2013 by White, Shapiro, and Winters. And the manipulation is information about the audit outcome of a hypothetical Mayor Carlos in a quote unquote municipality like yours. And so the idea is people internalize their sort of expectations of bureaucratic quality in their municipality, and they should respond to this type of information in a municipality like yours differently. So they had 3 treatment conditions: no information, a clean treatment, or a corrupt treatment. And they test a new prediction about updating on a clean. I'm going to test a new prediction about updating on a clean signal. This idea that, corruption wasn't detected. The last thing I'll show you is think about how we might measure citizen voting behavior. So here I will have administrative data on incumbent re-election. So I'll focus on one equilibrium implication of the model, and that is variation in where we should see incumbency disadvantage. So we know that there is high levels of incumbency disadvantage in Brazilian mayoral races. And so in principle, this is consistent with the Klasnian-Tatunik story, right, where they measure this, that we should see incumbency disadvantage in these regions, in these regions in which a first period incumbent politician will pool, but a second will not, right? So if we get to the second period, if we re-elect an incompetent type, it has, it's very negative, it has a detrimental effect on voter welfare. And so they'd rather, instead of sort of simply using the information they have, they'd rather re-elect a new politician who at least will serve as a first-term mayor trying to win re-election. Okay, so this will be measured from electoral returns in close elections in time t and t+1 across 3 different election cycles. All right. So in terms of the first test on voter behavior, what I want to show you first is that allocation to rents is decreasing in bureaucratic quality, right? And this sort of distinguishes the general model from the case with no bureaucrat, where we should see a separating equilibrium for all levels of bureaucratic quality. This is just sort of looking at the sign of the association between bureaucratic quality, this QM, and the rents extracted. So this is the proportion of audited funds where there were irregularities found. And so we should find that beta 1 is less than 0. I'll show you the linear version of this, as well as sort of tercile and quartile specifications of this QM. And what we see is we indeed see a negative association between bureaucratic quality and allocations to rents. So here with a linear measure, right, we see that with and without covariates, there's sort of a negative association between bureaucratic quality and allocation to rents. Here, compared to the first lowest tercile of bureaucratic quality, we see fewer rents extracted in the second, and then, we can sort of distinguish this for the third tercile, similarly for the quartile specifications. One thing that's going to sort of be important for the interpretation of the rest of the evidence is sort of how should we think about the range of bureaucratic quality in Brazil? So we have this measure of average bureaucratic education. We don't know exactly how this maps onto the parameter Q in the model. And so one thing that sort of surprised me is sort of the degree to which rents are circumscribed in this context, right? So we think about a lot of corruption, but indeed in the median municipality, it was only about 1.9% of funds being misused, and in the mean, it was only about 6%. Now, obviously, this is a long right tail, but I mean, sort of interpret this as being sort of somewhere in the upper regions. Like it doesn't seem like there's places in which, people are just sort of regularly extracting all the funds. So we'll sort of interpret this as being, higher up in this parameter space. And this helps us think about the implications for the rest of the tests. So the second test is that there's a term effect on the allocation. So the idea here is that the term effect, so the difference in sort of allocation to rents between a first and second term should be attenuated to 0 at high levels of bureaucratic quality, right? And so what this will do is this will try to separate the general model from the pure selection case and the uninformed voter case, right? So the idea is, in the model, without a bureaucrat, we should always see, lower rents in the second term than the first, only because we have more more competent types in the second period. If we had fully uninformed voters, we should see no difference from first to second term, right? And so basically, the place where you should see, an increase in rent in the second term is only in this part of this region of the parameter space. And so we know that there is this second term effect, so more second term shirking from the existing literature. What hasn't been shown is how this varies in bureaucratic quality, right? So the idea here is that the marginal effect of the second term on rents should be non-zero only at low levels of bureaucratic quality within this sample, right? This is sort of because Brazilian mayors are term limited to 2 consecutive terms, right? The second term is, their last in office. And so what we should see is that, there's more shirking in a second term, but that it sort of attenuates to 0. And this is precisely what we see in the data, right? So the marginal effect of the second term on politicians' allocation to rents, right? We see that the politicians are taking more at low levels of bureaucratic quality within sample, but this is sort of attenuated to 0. We can see this in both the linear and the nonlinear specifications. Okay.
Tara, just to point out, it's 3:46, so maybe 4 or 5 minutes more at maximum, please.
Yeah. I'll try to go through. I'll skip the second application, obviously. So the idea here is that first term incompetent politicians reduce allocation to rents to win re-election, which suggests that they perceive voters are watching. But this all happens at low levels of bureaucratic quality, which is sort of evidence of this pooling equilibrium at higher levels of bureaucratic quality. In terms of the third prediction, at high levels of Q, the voter's posterior is going to be equal to her prior upon receiving a signal that the politician allocated no funds to rents, right? So here, remember that the sort of survey experiment talks about politician allocation behavior, not public goods provision. So when we're in a pooling equilibrium in which everybody allocates funds to the public good, voters should not learn from seeing that it's a clean politician. And so what we're going to do here is we're trying to separate the general model from a pure selection model, right? In which across the entire parameter space, it would be informative to learn that, the politician was clean versus dirty, right? And so we should, in that case, we would expect that voters update on a clean signal everywhere. Okay. So what I will do is I'll show you the conditional average treatment effects of the clean audit treatment at different levels of bureaucratic quality. So what I'm going to do is I'll first show you, so I want to show you how this effect of a clean signal varies in the bureaucratic quality of the municipality governed by that looks like yours, right? So this is going to be a 7-point feeling thermometer towards the mayor. And sort of this learning should disappear as bureaucratic quality increases. Okay, I'll show you also the estimates for the corrupt signal for, parts of this parameter space. This would be simply sort of looking at off-path assumptions, but we'll focus on the clean signal here. So what we see here is that updating on the clean signal, which is this these blue dots, is attenuated to 0 as bureaucratic quality increases. And so this is evidence that voters update consistently with general model predictions. So at higher levels of bureaucratic quality, right, this is attenuated to 0. Voters are only learning from about having a clean bureaucrat at sort of low levels within the sample. Okay. In the interest of time, I will go to the discussion. I need to answer more Q&A about the project, about the last test, if you have them. So, I mean, one thing that I sort of see this paper as doing is like we've spent a lot of time trying to measure aspects of this accountability relationship, but I see it as like largely trying to be concentrated under single lamps in this way. And so I think like what this model and this sort of paper tries to do is tries to connect this and tries to sort of connect this to a broader story that applies sort of across contexts, across times, that might help us learn why we see the mixed results that we do. So I think there's sort of three main implications that I'd like you to take away. First, the sort of observable implications of what I call sort of functioning accountability relations, those in which voters are actually able to observe what the politician is doing and updating and then sort of voting on the basis of those beliefs, should look different in different places, right? The critical observation here is that this stems from the co-production of public goods by politicians and bureaucrats. A second sort of piece of this that is, you know, present in some of my other work is that like bad outcomes, these sort of, you know, poor outcomes, corruption, you know, lack of public goods provision, don't necessarily need generated by sort of your venal politicians, your, you know, your uninformed voters. Here, you know, yes, there's, you know, a moral hazard problem with the bureaucrat, but aside from sort of that, you know, shirking by the bureaucrat, there's sort of nothing that sort of no bad intentions that are generating these outcomes. And this is not to say that bad intentions can't generate bad outcomes. The idea here is that we need to be able to understand what the range of explanations for these, you know, poor outcomes is in order to understand, you know, what might fix those. And so I think the last thing is that like we often, you know, I'm a comparativist in political science, and often I think we overemphasize similarities rather than differences in terms of what we learn from this. Here we have a common model that provides different implications, and at least within Brazil and these information experiments, there's suggestive evidence that this more general model may explain behavior. So thank you so much for your time. I'm sorry for going a little bit over.
Okay, well, thank you, Tara. That was absolutely no problem. It's the standard way it works, actually. There's, I think Arda has raised his hand, Eduardo as well. So perhaps we go in that order. Would you guys just unmute yourselves, please?